Here we are then, the last one. This is the Geography Paper 3 pre-exam revision video. I'm just going to give you a few tips, a bit of an overview of what to expect on the paper tomorrow. Now the paper's only now along this year. You've got two sections. Section A is the issue evaluation. So you spend about half an hour on that section. That's the one where you can have some questions based on the resource booklet that we looked at in lesson. So that's the one about waste management, about the proposed incinerator. Then section B, that's all about fieldwork. And although we've not really done any fieldwork at GCSE, you will get some fieldwork questions on sort of made up, unseen fieldwork inquiries. There'll be some questions maybe about sampling or data presentation techniques, maybe a few graphs as well. So again, about half an hour to spend on that. Now, as I say, I'm going to give you a few tips for section A to start with. Now, in terms of section A, the main thing to maybe try and prepare for is the 9-mark question. Now, we don't know for definite what that's going to be, but it's most likely that the 9-mark question will be asking you whether or not you think that that proposed incinerator, the one that was rejected by the government, whether or not you think that decision was correct, basically. So was it right for the government to reject the plans for the incinerator? That's what the most likely question might be. Now, we did have a practice at this in lesson. Now, remember, a couple of tips are that you should have a little introduction, maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs in the middle, and then a short conclusion. In your introduction, that's where you might start by giving your overall view. And ideally, you're going to use some evaluative language. So you might say something like, I partially agree with the government's decision to reject the incinerator because, and you might just summarise what your main points are going to be. Obviously, your main section, that's where you write a few paragraphs to support your argument. Make sure you're using the resource booklet to back up your argument, so you can use quotes, facts and figures from the booklet to support what you're saying. It's really important though that you give both sides of the argument. So you can say that you do agree with the government's decision, but if you do that, make sure you say, however, somebody else could argue that, or it might be argued that the government were wrong and it should have been built for this reason. So make sure you do give both sides of the argument. And then obviously have a little conclusion that summarises what your whole argument was. Again, you might say, I partially agree overall, or I agree to a small extent overall, etc. Now, I'm not going to talk too much more about it, but there is a model answer in the files section of Teams. So I would have a read through this as a bit of an idea. You don't have to agree with me, but it gives you an idea about, how to structure your answer, how to use the resource booklet to support what you're saying. You do get 3 marks for spelling, punctuation, grammar and use of keywords. So notice I've got some key phrases like waste hierarchy, multiplier effect, carbon footprint. So try and get some keywords in there as well. Just 1 or 2 other tips for section A. As I say, use the resource booklet, but don't just copy out chunks of text. Use it to back up your point. So make a point and then quote something from the resource booklet that supports your point. Don't just copy out loads of the booklet. You won't get marks, very many at all anyway, if you just copy out loads of the booklet. So do quote, obviously, figures from graphs, maps if they're relevant. And in terms of preparing, I would just make sure you're really familiar with where everything is in the booklet. You don't have the time to be rummaging around looking for things too much, so just make sure you're really familiar with what's where, make sure you understand it all, and that just makes sure that'll help you be prepared for the exam. There is a map, pretty much guaranteed there's going to be some map skills questions. Just a reminder that 4-figure grid references, you need to go along the corridor first and then up the side, and if you're looking at a particular square, it's the bottom left corner of the square that you want. So if you're trying to give a 4-figure grid reference, look at the square you want, look at the bottom left corner of that square, and then give the number on the bottom first, then the number on the side. Remember, 6-figure grid references, you're sort of imagining that each square on the map has got little numbers 1 to 9 along it and 1 to 9 up it, and you're sort of giving the 4-figure grid reference, but after you give the number on the bottom, you're adding one of those digits between 1 and 9. So you might say sort of 4, 5, 1 or 4, 5, 5, and then you go up and it might be, say, 6, 2, 1 or 6, 2, 6. And you're just adding in a little bit number between 1 and 9 after the 2 parts of the 4-figure grid reference. In terms of measuring distance, remember to measure it with a ruler, then compare it to the scale at the bottom. Notice we've got that scale where it goes up to 2 kilometres there. If you've got a curved line to measure, you can ask for a bit of paper to help you with that. I'm just going to leave this here. If you want a bit more detail, you can read that and pause the video. Right, now section B, that's the unseen fieldwork section. Now, you could get asked some of these different things here. You could get asked to suggest possible data that could be collected at certain situations, or what inquiries, what research questions there could be at a certain site. You could get asked about how data should be presented, like what graphs to use and why. You could get asked about the advantages, disadvantages of different ways of collecting data or presenting data. You might be asked to describe graphs, complete graphs. You might be asked to work out mean, mode, median, interquartile range, etc. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but in the files section of Teams, there is a knowledge organiser with everything you need on there. Now, I suggest you make sure you double check you know what the sampling types are and you know the data presentation methods. So make sure you know which type of graph is used for percentages and for changes over time and for, different types of data. Make sure you know possible advantages and disadvantages of each one. If you want to know a bit more about what the questions might look like, we did have a look at this in lesson, but there is this booklet that's also in the file section of Teams with some questions on. If you scroll further down, the answers are there as well, so you can have a bit of a look at what the questions might be like, what sort of answers to give. Last couple of tips for that section I've got here. So if you, in terms of data collection, you can make data collection. That's actually when you recording data, taking measurements. You can often make that more reliable by using advanced equipment. So like a flow meter, which is a technical piece of equipment to measure river velocity. That's more accurate than using a dog biscuit and timing how long it takes to float 3 meters. If you want to make something more reliable and you want to improve the reliability of your data, then a good answer to always give is just collect more of it. It's more reliable to have 100 questionnaires where you're asking people's opinion about regeneration than it is only to have 5. Also, it might be good to collect data at different times of year, different times of day, maybe different locations. That can improve reliability. As I say, make sure you know about sampling. Random sampling isn't just where you randomly select data or randomly ask people questions. It often involves using a random number generator to avoid bias. Systematic sampling, remember, that's when you take measurements at regular intervals. So you might measure the depth of a river every 2 meters. That means you get a good spread of data all the way across the river. Whereas with random sampling, you could end up with all your data at one side of the river, for example. If you're doing a questionnaire, you can actually just ask every, say, 5th person. That's systematic sampling. That helps avoid bias as well. In terms of the graphs as well, one thing to remember is line graphs. They're the ones that show changes over time. So on a line graph, you usually have time on the bottom, or maybe even distance on the bottom. Whereas a scatter graph, that you could have pretty much anything, and you're just comparing 2 sets of data to see if there's a link between the 2. A scatter graph is the one where you would normally draw a line of best fit. Alright, I'm not going to talk too much about it. As I say, have a look in the files section of Teams. Try and make sure you're familiar with those sorts of things there. Good luck with it all. Obviously, it is an important exam. It's still a third of the GCSE, but if you use those resources there, you should be fine. Alright, good luck. Take care.